The oil was still dripping from my wheelchair ramp when I looked up and saw her standing there, smiling. My neighbors rushed to help me as I lay on the concrete, my prosthetic leg twisted beneath me. The HOA president just stood there with the oil can in her hand. She thought she was punishing the guy with the ugly ramp, but she had no idea she'd just declared war on a special forces colonel. 28 years of military strategic operations were about to be deployed on a battlefield she never expected, our quiet suburban neighborhood. After 28 years of distinguished special forces service, I returned to civilian life with 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and missing half my left leg. The IED explosion in Afghanistan that took my limb couldn't take my spirit or my tactical mind. When I purchased my home in Oakwood Estates, I explained, I was looking for peace. I'd coordinated counterterrorism operations across 3 continents. I'd led men into combat zones where split-second decisions meant life or death. After all that, I wanted a quiet place where my grandchildren could visit, where I could plant a garden, where I could finally exhale. The modest 2-story home needed modifications. The steep, short ramp connecting my porch to the street was professionally installed with all proper permits, a necessary accommodation that gave me independence despite my wheelchair. I meticulously painted it to match the house's taupe siding and added small, tasteful planters along the sides. I've always been detail-oriented, I say with a slight smile. In Special Forces, details keep you alive. So I made sure that ramp was not just functional, but as aesthetically pleasing as possible. The American flag that had followed me through deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and covert operations I still couldn't discuss now flew proudly above my porch. That flag meant something to me. It represented everything I'd fought to protect, including the right to live with dignity in the country I served. My neighbors initially seemed welcoming. Several were veterans themselves. Mrs. Abernathy across the street brought homemade bread. The Rodriguez family next door helped with lawn work while I was still adjusting to my prosthetic. For the first 3 months, Oakwood Estates felt like the sanctuary I'd been seeking. I should have recognized the warning signs. I reflect. In hostile territories, there's often a period of calm before the ambush. I let my guard down. That was my first tactical error. The certified letter arrived exactly 90 days after I moved in. Unauthorized exterior modification. Read the official-looking notice on Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association letterhead. Remove wheelchair access ramp within 14 days or face daily fines of $100. The letter was signed by Margaret Wilson, a 40-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager who'd recently become HOA president through a contested election with suspiciously low turnout. Only 17% of homeowners had voted, most unaware an election was even happening. I was confused at first. I'd followed every regulation, obtained every permit from the city. The ramp was fully compliant with ADA specifications. I immediately called the HOA office and left a message explaining the situation. 3 days later, Margaret herself knocked on my door. Her professional attire and corporate smile couldn't mask the cold assessment in her eyes as she looked past me to inspect my home interior. "Mr. Peterson," she began, deliberately omitting my military rank. "While we appreciate your special circumstances, Oakwood Estates has standards to maintain. Your ramp faces the street and creates an institutional appearance inconsistent with our community aesthetic." I remained calm, wheeling to my office to retrieve my documentation. "Ms. Wilson, I understand aesthetic concerns, but this accommodation is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Here are the permits and approval documents." Margaret barely glanced at the papers. "The ADA doesn't supersede our covenant," she declared incorrectly. "Besides, there are other options for people in your situation. Perhaps a retirement community would be more suitable, or you could install a less visible access point at the rear of your home." "The rear of my home has a 6-foot drop to the yard," I explained evenly, "and I have no intention of moving. I've served this country for nearly 3 decades. I have every right to live here." Something flickered in Margaret's expression, not compassion, but annoyance at being challenged. "Well," she said, her smile tightening, "we'll see how the board votes on this matter." At the next HOA meeting, I wheeled myself to the front when my violation came up on the agenda. I presented my documentation politely, explained my military service, and outlined the ADA protections that applied to my situation. Several neighbors nodded supportively, but no one spoke up. The board, composed entirely of Margaret's friends, voted 5-0 to uphold the violation. I was given 30 days to remedy the situation or face escalating fines. After the meeting, an elderly neighbor approached me in the parking lot. I recount. He wouldn't look me in the eye, but he whispered she does this to everyone who stands out. The Hispanic family with the religious shrine in their garden. The young couple with the autistic son who needed special playground equipment. She finds something in the covenant and twists it. Most people just give in. Over the next month, I received 4 more violation notices. Unauthorized flag display. Improper landscape maintenance. Unapproved exterior color scheme. Prohibited vehicle storage. The last referring to my wheelchair when I briefly left it on the porch while gardening. She didn't want compliance. One neighbor confided privately. She wanted control, and she enjoyed exercising it. I learned that Margaret's career in pharmaceutical sales had stalled after complaints about her aggressive tactics. But in Oakwood Estates, she wielded absolute power and seemed intoxicated by it. In my military career, I'd encountered people like Margaret, I say. Individuals who use rules as weapons rather than guides. Who derive satisfaction from others' distress. In war zones, they become warlords. In the suburbs, they become tyrants with clipboards. May 17th began like any other Tuesday. I had a morning physical therapy appointment and wheeled myself toward the steep, short ramp that connected my property to the street where my adapted van was parked. The American flag fluttered above my porch in the spring breeze. I remember thinking it was a beautiful day, I say quietly. Funny how clear those moments stay with you. The calm before everything changes. My wheelchair hit the ramp, and immediately something felt wrong. The wheels slipped violently, as if on ice. The chair lurched forward uncontrollably, picking up speed. I frantically tried to grip the wheels, but my hands slid off. The wheelchair stopped abruptly halfway down the ramp when it hit an uneven section, but my momentum carried me forward. 28 years in combat zones, and I was taken down by cooking oil on my own property, I say with a grim laugh. I crashed hard onto the concrete sidewalk. Pain shot through my body as I landed, my prosthetic leg twisting awkwardly beneath me. My right wrist took most of the impact with a sickening crack. Blood from my forehead dripped onto the pavement. Disoriented and in shock, I looked up through blurred vision, pain pulsing in waves. There she was, Margaret Wilson, standing about 15 feet away, watching me sprawled on the ground like she was admiring a piece of art. The morning sun glinted off something in her hand, a canister clearly labeled oil. Her lips curved in that expression I'd seen so many times in war zones. The satisfaction of a predator over wounded prey. In that moment, my neighborhood had become hostile territory. The pain was intense, I recall, but it was the humiliation that cut deeper. At that moment, I wasn't Colonel Peterson who'd led classified operations and saved countless lives. I was just a disabled man lying helpless on the ground while someone took pleasure in my suffering. Margaret made no move to help me as I struggled to right myself. My military-issue prosthetic was visibly damaged, the alignment mechanism bent from the impact. Every attempt to move sent shooting pain through my wrist. I recognized that look on her face, I say. I'd seen it on the faces of enemies who thought they'd won. But I'd learned long ago, the battle isn't over until you decide it's over. What have you done? I gasped, trying to push myself up despite the searing pain in my wrist. Margaret stepped forward, still holding the oil can. I warned you about that eyesore of a ramp. The HOA covenant clearly states all exterior modifications must maintain neighborhood aesthetics. You could have killed me, I shouted, my military command voice returning through the pain. Don't be so dramatic, Margaret scoffed. If you can't safely navigate your own property, perhaps Oakwood Estates isn't the right community for someone in your condition. The cruelty of her words hit harder than the fall. In that moment, I saw something I recognized from war zones, the casual dehumanization that precedes violence. "My condition," I replied, voice suddenly calm with the clarity that comes in crisis. "My condition is that I lost my leg defending your right to be this cruel. But I didn't lose my mind, and I didn't lose my fight." Margaret's expression flickered, the first hint of uncertainty. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," I continued, my tactical mind already calculating responses despite my physical pain. "This isn't just assault. It's a hate crime against a disabled veteran." The Rodriguez family from next door rushed over, having heard the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez gasped at the blood on my face while her husband moved to help me. "We saw everything, Colonel Peterson," Mr. Rodriguez said while glaring at Margaret. "And our security camera caught it too. It's pointed right at the street for package deliveries." Margaret's smug expression crumbled momentarily before she recovered. "You have no proof I did anything wrong. I was simply inspecting a covenant violation when he lost control. Perhaps if you'd followed HOA regulations in the first place." As neighbors gathered around to help me back into my wheelchair, Mrs. Abernathy from across the street approached with a first aid kit. "Should we call an ambulance, Colonel?" she asked, already pressing a clean cloth to my bleeding forehead. "No," I said firmly, looking directly at Margaret. "Call the police." Margaret's face paled as she backed away, suddenly realizing the seriousness of what she'd done. "This is ridiculous. It's a private HOA matter, not a police matter. Assault with intent to cause bodily harm is absolutely a police matter," I replied, my decades of authority evident despite my position on the ground. "As is tampering with accessibility equipment for a disabled person." As Margaret retreated toward her own home, I called after her, "One more thing, Ms. Wilson. In Special Forces, we're taught that the most dangerous moment isn't when you're hurt. It's when your opponent thinks you're defeated and drops their guard. You've made a serious tactical error today." The responding officers took statements from me and the witnesses, photographed the oil-slicked ramp, and collected the canister Margaret had discarded in a nearby bush. When they noted my military background, one officer, a former Marine, stood at attention momentarily despite my disheveled state. "Sir," the officer said quietly, "we've got this. What she did, it's not right." The medical assessment was extensive. A broken wrist requiring surgery, facial lacerations needing stitches, a mild concussion, and a damaged prosthetic that would cost $12,700 to replace. But the deeper wounds were invisible. Echo base compromised. That's how my military mind processed it. I'd survived ambushes in Kandahar, crossfire in Fallujah, and even brief captivity during an op that remains classified. I say, my voice tightening as the memories flood back. But this attack in my own AO, my area of operations, my sanctuary, executed by someone who should have been an ally, that breached my defenses in a way enemy combatants never had. For the first time since my initial rehabilitation, I found myself struggling with tasks I'd mastered years ago. With my dominant wrist in a cast and my prosthetic damaged, simple activities became monumental challenges. Dressing, cooking, personal care. The independence I'd fought so hard to regain was suddenly compromised. Nightmares plagued my sleep. Not just flashbacks to combat, but new dreams where I was falling endlessly while faceless figures watched and smiled. I found myself checking the ramp constantly, afraid to leave my home. My VA therapist diagnosed an acute PTSD relapse. There's a special kind of betrayal, I explain, when the country you fought for doesn't fight for you. When the flag you defend doesn't defend you back. My daughter canceled my grandson's planned visit, concerned about my living situation. My physical therapy appointments were missed because I couldn't safely exit my home. Margaret's attack had accomplished exactly what she wanted, isolating the problem neighbor and making me invisible. For 2 weeks, she maintained tactical superiority, I admit. I hit rock bottom one night, sitting in the dark, evaluating retreat as the only viable option. Negative sitrep on all fronts. But then, like a radio call in enemy territory, I heard the words my commander told me after I lost my leg. "You're still the same strategist, the same leader, the same fighter. Only the battlefield has changed, not the warrior. In that moment, I began planning the counteroffensive. That realization came with a visit from an unexpected ally, a VA social worker who specialized in helping disabled veterans fight housing discrimination. "Colonel," she said during a home visit, "what happened to you isn't just wrong. It's criminal, and we're going to treat it that way." In that moment, I remembered who I was. In Special Forces, we're trained to use even the darkest moments to our advantage. Margaret thought she'd broken me. Instead, she'd given me a new mission. In combat, intelligence wins wars, I tell myself as I assess my options. And I was about to execute the most thorough intelligence operation of my entire military career. Margaret had just activated an adversary she should never have provoked. Despite my physical limitations, I leveraged my most valuable asset, my strategic mind. I contacted former intelligence officers I'd served with who now worked in digital forensics. Together, we began mapping Margaret's web of influence and control. The Rodriguez family provided their security footage, which clearly showed Margaret approaching at dawn with the oil can, deliberately pouring it across the ramp's surface, then waiting nearby, as if anticipating the results. But this was just the beginning. With military precision, I created a secure communication channel for neighbors to share their experiences without fear of retaliation. The floodgates opened. The elderly widow who suddenly moved out after installing a memorial garden for her late husband, Margaret, had threatened to place a lien on her home over the unauthorized decoration. The family with an autistic child who was fined daily for therapeutic equipment in their backyard. The Latino family whose cultural decorations were deemed not in keeping with neighborhood character. It wasn't random, I say. She specifically targeted people who couldn't fight back: the elderly, minorities, families with medical needs. Classic predator behavior. A former neighbor who had moved 6 months earlier provided the most disturbing information. Margaret had campaigned for HOA president on a platform of protecting property values from undesirable elements, thinly veiled language that many residents missed, but I recognized from my human rights work overseas. In my counterterrorism work, we looked for pattern recognition, I explained. Margaret had a clear pattern of escalating harassment until the target moved away. Then property values would mysteriously drop, and one of 3 investment companies would purchase the home. I had my analysts check the ownership records. All 3 companies traced back to shell corporations with the same registered agent, Margaret's brother-in-law. When a retired detective who lived 2 doors down shared that Margaret had been investigated for patient abuse at her previous job in pharmaceutical sales, the final puzzle piece clicked into place. This wasn't about property values, I realized. This was about power, cruelty, and financial gain, and it had to be stopped. In Special Forces, we don't just react to attacks. We develop multi-phase operations to neutralize threats, I explained. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice and protection. I contacted my former JAG officer and close friend, Colonel Sarah Martinez, who now ran a specialized law practice focusing on ADA violations. She helped file a comprehensive ADA complaint and coordinated with local police on the assault charges. The detective assigned to the case was a Gulf War veteran himself. When he saw the security footage of Margaret's actions and my fall, he immediately classified it as assault with intent to cause bodily harm, a felony given my disabled status under state hate crime enhancements. The detective was thorough, I note with approval. He didn't just focus on my case. He started looking at a pattern of incidents in the neighborhood. Then came the first shocking twist. During the police investigation, officers discovered financial irregularities in the HOA books. Margaret had been embezzling from the HOA reserve fund, over $87,000 missing over 3 years, disguised as legal consultations that never occurred. She never expected anyone to check her actions, I note. Bullies rely on fear to prevent scrutiny. The detective obtained a warrant to search Margaret's home computer. They discovered emails between Margaret and several real estate investors discussing how to encourage problematic residents to relocate to create buying opportunities. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was clear: Manufactured HOA violations were being used to drive down property values for insider purchases. Meanwhile, I organized a covert coalition of neighbors, collecting signed statements about Margaret's pattern of harassment and discrimination. Using secure communication methods from my military days, I created a protected environment where fearful neighbors could share experiences without risking Margaret's retaliation. The most unexpected revelation came from a title search. Margaret didn't actually own her home. She was renting from one of the same investment companies that had purchased other homes in the neighborhood, a clear violation of HOA bylaws that specifically prohibited renters from serving on the board. Her entire presidency was illegitimate. Sometimes your opponent defeats themselves, I observe. All you need to do is reveal the truth they've been hiding. In the military, we know that timing and allies are everything, I explain. The moment had come to bring in the heavy artillery. With my intelligence operation complete, I strategically released information to key allies. My first call was to Melissa Chun, an investigative reporter I'd helped during her embedded journalism in Afghanistan years earlier. When she heard about a decorated war hero being targeted by his HOA, she didn't just run a story, she launched an investigation. Melissa didn't focus just on my case, I explain. She uncovered a disturbing pattern of HOA abuses against disabled residents across the region. She found 15 similar cases in 3 counties where residents with visible disabilities were systematically harassed until they moved. The story ran first locally, then was picked up by national outlets. Veterans groups organized a peaceful demonstration in the neighborhood. Over 200 former service members standing silently along the street, many in wheelchairs or with prosthetics holding American flags. The image went viral, shared millions of times across social platforms. We didn't say a word. I remember. We didn't have to. The contrast between what we'd sacrificed and how we were being treated spoke volumes. Former military colleagues, now working in government, law, and business, offered support. A senator who had served with me personally called the district attorney. The state's attorney general announced an investigation into disability discrimination in HOAs statewide. The second shocking twist came when 3 other neighborhoods reported similar problems with Margaret. She had apparently moved from community to community, taking control of HOAs, embezzling funds, then disappearing before being caught. She wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor, I realized. She was a predator who had systematically targeted communities for years. Margaret tried to fight back with threatening letters and late-night phone calls to witnesses. But intimidation only works when the target is afraid, I note. And I'd stopped being afraid the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for every vulnerable person she had targeted. Every military operation has a culmination point, I explain. The moment when all elements converge for maximum impact. An emergency HOA meeting was called, relocated to the community center to accommodate the overflow crowd. National news cameras waited outside. Veterans groups stood silently along the walkway as homeowners entered. I arrived early, setting up my presentation with military precision. When Margaret entered, flanked by 2 hastily hired attorneys, the room fell silent. I'd faced enemies across battlefields, I narrate, but nothing quite matches the feeling of facing someone who tried to harm you in what should have been your sanctuary. With calm, commanding presence, I presented my evidence methodically, just as I'd presented mission briefs to generals in secure underground facilities. Security footage of the oil incident played on a large screen, showing Margaret's deliberate actions and my painful fall. Documentation of Margaret's selective enforcement formed neat timeline charts. Expert testimony about ADA violations came from nationally recognized authorities. Financial records revealed the embezzlement scheme in meticulous detail. Legal opinions confirmed her fraudulent presidency, given her rental status. And finally, statements from 37 current and former neighbors detailed similar experiences of intimidation, harassment, and discrimination. The third shocking twist came when Margaret's attorneys abruptly stood up halfway through the presentation. "We are withdrawing as counsel," they announced, gathering their papers. We cannot continue representation given evidence of criminal actions. They left Margaret sitting alone as the room erupted in murmurs. When Margaret tried to dismiss the accusations as persecution of a dedicated volunteer, I unveiled my final evidence. Recordings of Margaret threatening elderly residents, mocking a disabled child, and boasting about how she enjoyed making undesirables leave the neighborhood. My neighborhood deserves better, I concluded. America's disabled veterans deserve better. And every person who has ever felt victimized by those who abuse power deserves better. This isn't just about a wheelchair ramp. This is about what kind of community, what kind of country we want to be. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Victory isn't just about defeating your enemy, I reflect. It's about building something better from the ruins of conflict. The board voted unanimously to remove Margaret as president and revise HOA bylaws to better protect homeowners with disabilities. The district attorney filed multiple criminal charges: assault, embezzlement, fraud, elder abuse, and hate crimes against disabled residents. Margaret faced not just civil liability for ADA violations, but significant prison time. The investment companies connected to Margaret were investigated for real estate fraud and predatory practices. Property titles were scrutinized, revealing a pattern of artificially depressed sales and insider dealing that spanned 5 counties and 7 years. The most unexpected development: Margaret's predatory pattern across multiple HOAs led to state legislature hearings on HOA reform. I testified, still in my wheelchair, the damaged ramp photo displayed on large screens behind me. This isn't about one bad actor, I told lawmakers. This is about systems that enable abuse of power and fail to protect vulnerable Americans. 6 months later, the governor signed the Veterans and Disabled Persons Housing Protection Act, with me and other survivors of HOA discrimination standing behind him at the ceremony. The legislation created new protections for disabled homeowners and veterans, stricter oversight of HOA governance, and enhanced penalties for discriminatory practices. Back in Oakwood Estates, I was elected to the new HOA board, where I implemented transparency measures and community building initiatives. Monthly neighborhood gatherings replaced punitive HOA meetings. A diversity committee ensured all voices were heard in community decisions. The most meaningful victory, I say with emotion, was replacing my old ramp with a new community-designed accessibility entrance that neighbors helped build together. They didn't just make it functional. They made it beautiful, with planters, gradual inclines, and benches where neighbors could sit and talk. The neighborhood transformed from one ruled by fear to one known for its inclusivity and support for veterans. Property values actually increased as the community's reputation for warmth and acceptance spread. The final touching revelation: the elderly widow who had been forced out returned to the neighborhood, welcomed back by a community that had found its voice and its heart. Her memorial garden was reinstated with a special plaque honoring both her late husband and the courage of those who stand against injustice. That oil was meant to make me fall, I say, now standing at my new ramp with my prosthetic proudly visible. Instead, it became the foundation for something stronger than hate. Sometimes our worst moments can fuel our greatest victories, if we remember that true strength isn't about standing alone, but about lifting others when they fall. The HOA never knew they were going to war with a decorated commander. But more importantly, they never knew they were going to lose to a community that finally found its courage.